Kia ora, I'm Miriam McCummell. He was the man hired to put the David Bain case to bed. End of story. But that's not what happened. Instead, Canadian former Supreme Court Judge Ian Binnie, the man tasked by our government with investigating the case, says he found himself on trial. Criticised and humiliated after finding that David Bain was innocent and deserving of compensation, the results of his year-long inquiry thrown back in his face by New Zealand politicians. Tonight, you'll hear some of Ian Binnie's crucial Q&A with David Bain himself. And in his first New Zealand television interview, Ian Binnie speaks with Janet McIntyre about being caught in the middle when Kiwi politics and justice collide.
I felt that I'd gone to New Zealand, which I like very much, and got mugged.
Toronto, 4.5 years down the track and thousands of kilometres from New Zealand, former Canadian Supreme Court Judge Ian Binnie QC is still smarting from the way he was treated by the New Zealand government.
They got the answer they wanted. All right, so they can claim victory. Victory at what expense? Victory at the reputation of New Zealand as a fair-dealing country.
Ian Binnie has had a glittering career as a highly respected judge, described here in Canada as one of the most influential legal minds in the land. His opinion, his presence, is sought out by organisations as powerful as the United Nations. In 2011, out of the blue, he got a phone call from the New Zealand government. He had no idea of the firestorm he was about to walk into.
5 years on, still no one's prepared to make a call on compensation.
It's not going to help David Bain putting forward a report in which I don't believe would stand up to public scrutiny.
I cannot make a decision based on what is in front of us.
He's going to want to take it on after what happened to Binnie.
Ian Binnie's report into the Bain case was trashed by the then Justice Minister Judith Collins.
It is simply not credible.
Oh, crusher. Yes. Well, I didn't feel crushed, you know, but I felt that if she could have, she would have.
5 members of one family, all dead.
It's the case that's divided New Zealand for 23 years. The mass murder in Every Street, Dunedin, in June 1994. David Bain claimed he'd come back from his paper round to find his whole family shot dead.
What's the matter? They're all dead. I came home and they're all dead.
But the jury didn't believe him, and he was jailed 13 years for their murders.
He's very, very upset. He seems to be convulsing downstairs at the moment, so he seems to be very, very upset indeed.
In 2007, the Privy Council quashed Bain's convictions, and after a second trial, he was found not guilty.
Did you have any doubts today, Joe?
No doubts today, no doubts since 1996.
But was he innocent? That's what David Bain now needed to prove to the government before it would consider compensation for his years in prison. The then Justice Minister Simon Power turned to Ian Binnie in Canada. His brief to determine, was David Bain innocent?
Did you know anything about the David Bain case?
Nothing. It was a wrongful conviction, that it was highly controversial. I was told later that nothing I would say would change anybody's mind, and that the best advice would be to deliver the report on my way to the airport.
Having made his way to the very top of Canada's legal profession, first as a barrister, then the Deputy Minister of Justice, right through the courts to Supreme Court Judge, Ian Binnie had developed a strong interest in cases of wrongful conviction. The Bain case intrigued him.
What was your starting point?
Starting point was the Privy Council. The legal system has pronounced at the highest level there was a substantial miscarriage of justice and a wrongful conviction, period.
So with that in mind, was it inevitable that you were going to go down a path that would lead you to finding him innocent?
No.
11,000 pages of documents to work through, court transcripts, interviews, photographs, 10 months of work.
And this is not at all the material. This is the material I brought home.
But crucial for Ian Binnie was to meet David Bain face to face.
I want to talk to that man. He's still alive. I can hear his answers and make up my own mind if I think he's pulling a fast one.
And they did meet at Auckland's Copthorne Hotel, along with Bain's longtime supporter, Joe Karam.
I had the impression that quite often when you see them on television, David Bain is about to say something and Joe Karam would speak for him. I wanted to sort of liberate David Bain to talk for himself.
So he sat Joe behind David.
Well, I just didn't want it suggested that, there were nods and winks going back and forth. I was concerned that somebody might suggest afterwards somehow there was some communication between Joe Karam and David Bain during the interview.
How willing did you find David Bain as an interviewee?
I found him very willing, very straightforward. He's an interesting man. He's a huge man. When I was introduced to him, I mean, I'm 6'1" and he towered over me. He didn't exhibit any great sense of humor in our conversation because it wasn't a humorous topic.
So would you be interested in hearing some of that interview?
Sure.
Mr. Binnie would later be criticised for relying too heavily on what David told him.
Could I have your full name, please?
My full name is David Bain.
And do you swear that in answer to the questions I pose, you will give the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do so.
For the first time, you're about to listen to David Bain describing finding his family dead. First, his mother, Margaret.
In my recall of the scene, her eyes were open.
I think the pathologists say it is more likely they were closed. Why didn't you, at that point, call emergency?
I'm sorry, I can't give you any rational answers from this point on.
Going from room to room, he says, he found his 13-year-old brother, Stephen, dead.
When you say you touched Stephen's shoulder, do you recall touching anything else?
I don't now recall touching.
Then Bain says he went to his sister Laniette's room where he heard something, a noise coming from her.
It sounded like, water going down a drain, dribbling down a drain.
But the allegation against you personally is if you heard noises from Laniette, your instinct should have been to rush over and try to help her.
In the statement I gave, I think I went into the room and up near the bed. I don't recall doing that.
You said it should have been his instinct to rush over and help her. Weren't you curious to know why he didn't do that?
It would have been my instinct, but his story up until that had been that he was in a state of shock, so I really wasn't surprised that he didn't react as you would, walking into your sister's room and hearing her gurgle.
So you accept that being in a state of shock was his excuse for why he didn't help her?
That's his explanation. I take the explanation, I put it together with the explanation he gave to a lot of other things, and I form an overall impression.
It took almost half an hour from the time David Bain arrived home for him to call emergency services.
They're all dead.
Who's all dead?
My family, they're all dead. Hurry up.
David Bain told Ian Binnie he blacked out after finding his family.
Can you explain what you are referring to when you talk about blacked out?
I have no memory of it happening.
And you buy that?
It happens. It happens.
It's striking, isn't it? David Bain seems to have a lot of memory lapses. And you put that to him yourself in the interview.
Yes.
And you yourself question whether it's a convenient lapse of memory.
Yes. That's one of the reasons I wanted to interview him. I wanted to get a sense of whether he was playing games, and I came away clearly with the impression that he was not playing games.
After the break, Ian Binnie's own theory, what he thinks really happened.
It's the ultimate act of revenge.
And the judge finds himself on trial.
I thought the whole thing was a stitch-up.
What kind of person murders their own family?
As the Crown put it, something snapped in somebody's head.
But who snapped? Former Canadian judge Ian Binnie says it was 58-year-old Robin Bain who killed 4 family members, sparing David out on his paper run before changing his clothes, then committing suicide. But David, remarkably, bears his father no malice, as he told Ian Binnie in 2012.
I respected my father, I still do. And the man that I knew, not the man that committed these things, but the man that I knew would never have harmed his family.
Is it really plausible that a man having murdered most of his family changes his clothes, cleans up some of the scene, then shoots himself? How plausible is that really?
I think it is plausible because it looks to me that Robin was putting the blame on David, setting him up.
What have I got to worry about today?
Binnie points to evidence of Robin's deteriorating mental health and the crumbling family dynamics. Robin banished from the house to a caravan out the back, his marriage broken, and David replacing him in Margaret's affections. Binnie reckons Robin set his son up to make him look like the murderer.
So Robin had a good deal of reason to resent David massively, and what better revenge could you have than to leave your son with the blame? What could be more damaging to David than to leave him under this cloud of suspicion that resulted in 13 years in prison for murdering the family? It's the ultimate act of revenge.
It's hard to imagine a father doing that to his son.
Is it any harder to imagine a son killing his entire family, having had no background of mental instability, no indication of imbalance, as against a father who had quite a history of mental issues?
But what about that cryptic message found on the family computer? You are the only one who deserved to stay. Binnie reckons Robin typed it, all part of his elaborate attempt to set David up as the killer.
To make it look like a fake suicide note.
Yeah.
It's a hell of a thing to do, to take out 4 innocent people just as vengeance on the son you loathe.
So these things happen, you know. Murders that from the outside seem inexplicable are inexplicable because we don't understand what's going on within these families until it's too late. Somebody snapped. Robin had a lot more reason to snap than David. David, so far as I can see, had no reason to snap.
The last thing that I could possibly have done was to take their lives.
How did Binnie get to this point? Why does he think David Bain is innocent?
We were extremely close. We all loved each other dearly.
First, he takes issue with the Crown's theory that David murdered 4 family members, went out on his paper round, and came back to kill his father.
If David Bain had in fact got up early, murdered his mother, his brother, his 2 sisters, why wouldn't he go out to the caravan where Robin was sleeping and put a bullet in his head? Why would he leave the house with all these bodies, knowing that Robin could walk in at any time and find them and call the police?
Ian Binnie says he considered all the available evidence to reach his conclusions, including the bloody sock prints found on the carpet.
Whoever made those footprints was likely the murderer.
Whose footprint was it?
I believe it was Robin's, because there were a number of tests done.
But there was contradictory evidence on that, wasn't there? It could equally have been David's footprint.
No, I don't think so at all.
Ian Binnie says if they were David's bloody footprints, and he then put on running shoes to do his paper round, it begs an explanation.
If he was wearing bloodied socks in the running shoes at the time he went on the paper route, there would be blood on the insoles. They examined the running shoes and found there was no evidence of blood stain.
But there was something in the evidence that did bother Ian Binnie. The broken glasses found in David's room, one of the lenses found in his murdered brother's room, the scene of a violent struggle with the killer. David's first trial lawyer claimed David told him back in 1995 he was wearing those glasses the night before the murders. That lawyer, Michael Guest, even told the Crown of his client's admission. But that's not what David Bain told Ian Binnie.
I hadn't thought of them, seen them, worn them, let alone wear those glasses at any time that week. The last time I ever thought of using them was months before.
You've got the problem that David told you he hadn't worn those glasses for months.
Yes.
But he told his first trial lawyer he'd been wearing them that weekend. How do you reconcile that?
I accept that he had worn them during the weekend, and I accept that that is a contradiction. I accept that it's a significant contradiction. I have to put it in the broader context of everything else that he has said.
If you accept David Bain was wearing those glasses and they were broken in the struggle, doesn't that point to David Bain being the killer?
It's not as simple as that. There are just too many unanswered questions relating to how those glasses got there.
But Ian Binnie didn't foresee how the glasses contradiction would be used to discredit his report. More on that later. There were other problems for Ian Binnie. Much of the original crime scene evidence had been lost or destroyed. Evidence which might have conclusively proved or disproved the case against David Bain.
He was denied the opportunity to make his case because the evidence that, according to the detective's manual, should have been preserved wasn't preserved.
What evidence?
They didn't preserve the luminol carpet. They didn't preserve the skin around the bullet wound in Robin Bain's head. What could be more fundamental in the investigation of a firearms murder than to look for firearms discharge residue on the alleged killer?
So what do you say about the police investigation?
I thought this investigation was exceptionally inept.
And overall, what do you conclude about David Bain?
In all probability, and I say that's a strong probability, I think he's innocent.
In August 2012, after almost a year of investigation, Ian Binnie delivered this report, almost 200 pages, to Justice Minister Judith Collins. It was forthright and critical. David Bain, he found, was not only innocent, he deserved compensation. This report sparked a furore.
Coming up, Ian Binnie summoned to the Beehive.
Be careful, you're entering the death zone.
The fracas and the fallout.
It's not going to help David Bain putting forward a report in which I don't believe would stand up to public scrutiny.
Judith Collins is the absolute poster case of why politicians should be kept out of it.
When Ian Binnie is not travelling the world as a judge and international arbitrator, he keeps bees.
They are amazing creatures. They live in very well organised little social communities without the need for government and lawyers and journalists. And they do a lot of good in the world, unlike lawyers, journalists and the rest.
What's the question you're most commonly asked about the bees?
People are most concerned about getting stung.
As he was once in another beehive far, far away. September 2012.
Well, I was in Cairo at a meeting of the International Commission of Jurists. It was urgent that I come to Wellington. I said, should we do this on the phone? It's a long way to Wellington. From Cairo. No, you got to come.
So he jumped on a plane and 2 days later he walked into Justice Minister Judith Collins' office.
Everybody's got a very long face. They say that there are errors in your report.
Were you concerned?
On the other hand, but I was surprised, how sort of hyperventilating they were about all of this. One official said she is very hostile. Very was skywriting, boldface, flashing, italics. Be careful, you're entering you know, the death zone. So I go up and I walk in, the minister is sitting there in a fluorescent pink something or other.
What did she say to you?
She said, you know, do you not think that you exceeded your mandate?
In Collins' view, Binnie had gone too far by recommending compensation, and she was upset about something else. An email she'd just received from Michael Guest, David Bain's first trial lawyer, who was concerned that Binnie's report pointed to Bain's innocence. Guest wrote that David's admission to him back in 1995 that David had been wearing those controversial glasses the night before the murders, a statement never tested in court, was damning. He said it shatters any suggestion of innocence.
In his view, David was guilty. An amazing thing for a lawyer to say of a former client. And his reason was the glasses. What the minister was exercised about was that David Bain's own lawyer would be denouncing him.
Lawyer Michael Guest, the author of that email, was disbarred in 2001 for dishonesty, unrelated to the Bain case, and later reinstated. But back to that meeting.
So we get into a very brief discussion of why I don't think Mr. Guest is the most reliable source. But there's no, you know, two-way discussion. There are these sort of volcanic statements followed by silence.
He says 15 minutes later, he was out the door on his way home to Canada.
I think after the event, no, she wants more about Michael Guest. So I put in more about Michael Guest and send that off.
4 months later, after Ian Binnie had made adjustments, retracted his recommendation for compensation and represented his report, Judith Collins called a press conference. She was not happy.
Simply not credible. I would never put a report like this up to my cabinet colleagues and ask them to make a decision based on it.
The minister had already commissioned a peer review of Ian Binnie's work. Former High Court Judge Dr. Robert Fisher QC found Binnie had exceeded his mandate by recommending David Bain be paid compensation. He had made errors and excluded significant evidence, like the bloodstains on David's clothing and his fingerprints on the rifle. Fisher added Binnie relied too heavily on David Bain's own accounts at the expense of the evidence.
I had nothing to do with the deaths of any members of my family.
And he'd been wrong to criticise the conduct of individual police and Crown witnesses without giving them the right of reply.
I thought the whole thing was a stitch-up. I was entirely clear that she was not going to accept the report. She was not going to accept the recommendation. The only question was how she would figure out a way of getting rid of it.
What do you think was going on in the background?
I think the government was bound and determined not to pay compensation. I think the police exert very powerful influence, particularly on Collins, who I gather had previously been the Minister of Police. And I think the issue was not the money. I think the issue was the stigma. They did not want to relieve David Bain of the stigma of being a serial murderer.
Why not?
Because that would mean the police had successfully prosecuted an innocent man who spent 13 years in prison and really had stigmatized him for life as a serial killer.
At the time, Judith Collins denied claims the government shopped round for the conclusion it wanted. In a statement to Sunday, she says she stands by all her statements and actions in this matter. She refutes Mr. Binnie's allegations and insinuations and refers back to the findings of the Fisher report and the subsequent investigation commissioned by her successor, Amy Adams.
I cannot make a decision based on what is in front of us.
Amy Adams, now the third Justice Minister, seeking more advice.
That advice came from retired Australian High Court Judge Ian Callanan QC, who, after another exhaustive inquiry, found the opposite of Ian Binnie, that David Bain had not established his innocence. And on the basis of that report, Cabinet denied him compensation. Then this.
The Crown has agreed to make an ex gratia payment of $925,000.
So why then, asks Ian Binnie, did the government pay almost $1 million towards David Bain's legal fees to a man they believed was not innocent of mass murder?
This thing has been political from the outset. I don't believe for a moment if the cabinet thought that David Bain was a serial killer, they would pay him $925,000. They wouldn't. They'd say, you know, we've at least got enough principle to deny a mass killer $925,000 of taxpayer money.
Ian Binnie still reflects on being summoned to New Zealand for what he calls a moronic meeting, a 15-minute dressing down by the then Justice Minister Collins, his report, a year of work, discarded.
And my thoughts were that this was a woman of surpassing arrogance, that she considered herself the centre of the universe and the rest of us were bit players who would come and go at her beck and call.
Ian Binnie says New Zealand needs an independent commission to scrutinise claims for compensation after wrongful convictions.
Judith Collins is the absolute poster case of why politicians should be kept out of it. She, in effect, backed the government into a position from which it couldn't retreat. Now, in the end, they got the answer they wanted. All right, so they can claim victory. Victory at what expense? Victory at the reputation of New Zealand as a fair-dealing country. Victory at the expense of a man who spent 13 years in jail and feels that he was, I'm going to say, screwed by the system.
So we sought a response from Justice Minister Amy Adams about why the government made the ex gratia payment of almost $1 million to a man who was unable to prove his innocence. She said the government set out in full the reasons at the time, which were in effect to recompense David Bain for time and costs. New Zealand's Criminal Bar Association has invited Ian Binnie to address its members in August. He's accepted.